I built this equipment empire from nothing. My son's voice echoed from the television mounted above the nurse's station, loud enough to rattle the plastic cup of water on my tray. The screen showed Evan holding a Crystal Anniversary Award, smiling under the massive lighting rigs I had personally wired and paid for. My phone buzzed against my left palm. The vibration sent a sharp sting up my forearm, a lingering gift from the stroke that had paralyzed my right side 6 weeks ago. The screen lit up with 35 missed calls. They were all from Evan's operations manager, likely panicking because the staging equipment for tomorrow's secondary event was locked in a warehouse only I had the key to. The air around me smelled of industrial bleach and scorched coffee. My physical therapist shifted beside my wheelchair, her stiff canvas scrubs rustling loudly as she leaned closer to the screen. "Sam," she said, pointing at the broadcast. "Isn't that your son? The one who runs your company?" "He runs the daily operations," I said. My voice sounded thin and gravelly. "I own the equipment." On screen, Evan adjusted his custom silk tie. "When I took over 5 years ago, I had one old truck and a vision. Now, we're the premier event management firm in the state." I closed my eyes and let the cold reality settle over me. 40 years of pulling heavy cables, driving forklifts through the night, and building Whitaker Equipment Holdings into a fortress had just been erased. I was 67 years old, sitting in a wheelchair I despised, watching my 40-year-old son rewrite history on live television. He didn't just want the business, so he decided to take the legacy too. Later that afternoon, a medical transport van dropped me off at my house. Evan didn't come, and his wife, Claire, was nowhere to be seen. A paid driver rolled me up the wooden ramp I had installed after my wife passed away. The house felt vast and hollow. I managed to transfer from the chair to the sofa, my right leg dragging heavy against the carpet. The silence of the living room pressed heavily against my ears. On the coffee table sat a massive arrangement of white lilies. The heavy and sweet scent made my stomach turn. I reached out with my good hand and pulled the card from the envelope. It was printed in a generic corporate font. "Wishing you a speedy recovery. From the team at Whitaker Event Management." Not a word of love. Not a single personal greeting from the boy I had raised. A corporate pleasantry from the company I had financed. My chest tightened with a dull pressure that had nothing to do with my medical condition and everything to do with betrayal. I glanced at the mantel above the fireplace. The silver frame that used to hold the picture of Evan and me at our first warehouse ribbon cutting was gone. In its place stood a pristine minimalist clock. He had cleared out my desk at the office, and apparently, he had cleared out the living room while I was learning how to swallow solid food again. The front door opened just after 6 o'clock. Evan walked in, still wearing the expensive suit from the broadcast. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of complete irritation, tossing his keys onto the credenza with a loud clatter. He stopped when he saw me on the sofa. For a fraction of a second, his polished executive mask slipped to reveal a flicker of guilt. Then his shoulders squared, and the arrogance slid right back into place. "You're home early," Evan said, checking his gold watch. "The hospital said they were keeping you until Friday." "Insurance capped the inpatient rehab," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "They called you yesterday morning to arrange the discharge." "I was busy, Dad. We had the 10-year gala." He loosened his tie and walked toward the kitchen. "I can't drop everything every time the doctors want a meeting. The company has to keep running." He poured himself a glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking sharply against the glass. The sound set my teeth on edge. "I watched the broadcast," I said. Evan paused in the doorway. "It went well. The investors were very impressed. You told them you built it from a single truck." "It's a marketing narrative," he snapped, waving his free hand dismissively. "People love a self-made story. Nobody wants to hear about a messy family handover." I looked at my right hand, resting uselessly on my knee. "I have outpatient therapy 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. I need someone to drive me." Evan sighed. A long and put-upon exhale echoed through the quiet room. He set his glass down on the counter and looked at me as if I were a stranger, asking for a handout. "I don't owe you anything," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You chose to step back," Evan continued, his tone perfectly reasonable and perfectly cold. "You have money. Hire a nurse. Call a driver. I have a business to run, and I can't be playing chauffeur because you refuse to pay for home care." I looked at the man standing in my living room. I searched his face for a trace of the boy who used to fall asleep on the passenger seat of my delivery truck. There was nothing there. Just a slick and impatient executive who believed he had outgrown his foundation. A sudden clarity settled over me. The anger vanished. replaced by a deep, absolute stillness. "I understand," I said softly. Evan seemed relieved that I wasn't going to yell. "Good. I'm glad we're on the same page. I have an early meeting with the venue director tomorrow." He picked up his briefcase. "Get some rest, Dad." He walked down the hall, leaving me alone with the cloying scent of corporate lilies. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then, I slowly pushed myself up from the sofa. Every movement required calculation and immense effort. I shuffled to my study, leaning heavily on my cane. The desk was mostly empty, but my old leather folio was still tucked in the bottom drawer. I managed to pull it out and set it on the mahogany surface. Inside was a stack of blank legal pads and my favorite heavy barrel pen. I sat down and positioned the pen in my right hand. My fingers felt numb and uncoordinated, completely disconnected from my brain. I gripped the barrel tightly, pressing the nib against the lined paper. I needed to write my name, Samuel Whitaker. The first attempt was a jagged and unintelligible scratch. The pen slipped, tearing a small hole through the paper. I took a deep breath, adjusted my grip, and tried again. The first letter looped wildly out of control. The second letter was just a sharp angle. My hand shook violently, muscles spasming in protest, but I forced the pen to keep moving. I dragged the ink across the page, carving the letters with sheer, stubborn force. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. I filled the first page with broken and trembling signatures. Then I turned to the second page. The strokes became slightly firmer, deeper, more deliberate. I wasn't just relearning how to write. I was reminding myself of exactly what my name meant. I reached for the telephone with my left hand and dialed a number I had known for 20 years. It rang twice before a familiar measured voice answered the line. "Marcus and Sterling. David speaking." "David," I said, staring down at the page of signatures. "It's Sam Whitaker." There was a brief pause. "Sam, I heard you were out of rehab. How are you holding up?" "I'm surviving." I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. "I need you to pull the operating agreement for Whitaker Equipment Holdings and the lease agreement we have with Evans Management Company." Paper rustled on the other end of the line. The attorney's voice dropped an octave, shifting from casual concern to sharp professional focus. "Did something happen, Sam? I thought you were leaving the structure alone until you officially retired." "Things have changed," I replied. "Evan believes he built the empire. He believes he doesn't owe me anything." David was quiet for a long moment. He had been the one to advise me, years ago, during the financial crisis, to separate my physical assets from the operating company. He knew exactly what Evan actually owned. "Nothing. I'll have the documents on your desk by tomorrow morning," David said finally, his tone tight with anticipation. "Are you finally ready to stop pretending those assets belong to him?" I looked down at the last signature on the pad. It was still shaky and uneven, but it was perfectly legible. It was legally binding. "Yes," I said. "It's time." David arrived at my house exactly at 10 o'clock the next morning. The attorney wore a crisp charcoal suit that felt entirely out of place in my quiet suburban living room, and he carried a battered leather briefcase that had seen decades of my family business. He did not offer empty sympathy about my physical condition. He simply took a seat across from me at the heavy oak dining table, popped the brass latches on his case, and pulled out 2 thick manila folders. The heavy thud of paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel dropping. I sat in my wheelchair, my paralyzed right leg resting stiffly on the footrest. The smell of fresh ink and old parchment drifted across the table, cutting through the lingering scent of those awful corporate lilies Evan had sent the day before. David opened the first folder and flattened the pages with his palm. He looked at me over the rims of his reading glasses. "I pulled everything you asked for," the lawyer said, his voice dropping into that quiet register he used for serious litigation. "I also spent the morning reviewing the original articles of organization from when we restructured after the financial crisis. Remind me exactly what my son actually owns," I told him. David turned a document around so it faced me. The heading read, "Whitaker Event Management." "Evan owns the operating shell," David explained, tapping a manicured finger against the paper. "He owns the brand name, the website domain, the client list, and the employee payroll accounts. He also holds the current contracts for the upcoming conferences. That is his entire kingdom." I looked down at the single sheet of paper. 5 years ago, I had handed Evan the keys to the daily operations because I thought he was ready to step up, and I wanted to ease myself into retirement. I'd given him the title of Chief Executive Officer so he could build his confidence. He took that title and convinced himself he was a self-made king. David slid the second folder toward me. This one was 3 inches thick, And this, the attorney said gently, is Whitaker Equipment Holdings. My left hand reached out and flipped the cover open. Page after page of asset schedules stared back at me. Every mobile stage, every heavy-duty lighting rig, all 14 transport trucks, the massive diesel generators, and the commercial warehouse itself. All of it belonged exclusively to the holding company. You are the sole member and manager of the holding company, David continued, watching my face carefully. The operating company merely rents the equipment from you. Furthermore, the insurance certificates for every piece of heavy machinery list Samuel Whitaker as the primary named insured. I let out a slow breath. The paper felt rough against my fingertips. Evan had spent 5 years treating my life work like his personal playground, making speeches on television about how he built an empire from nothing, but he had completely forgotten who actually owned the dirt he was standing on. Why didn't you transfer the holding company to him? David asked softly. We drafted the succession paperwork 2 years ago. You had every intention of signing it. I leaned back in the wheelchair and looked out the window at my overgrown garden. I remembered sitting in David's office, holding the pen, ready to sign away the physical foundation of my entire life. I wanted to wait until the official retirement party, I said, my voice tight. I wanted to hand him the master keys to the warehouse in front of the whole crew. Then the stroke happened. Everything got put on hold. And now? Now I know exactly what he does when he thinks I am no longer useful. The memory of Evan standing in my living room yesterday flashed behind my eyes. He had looked at me, a man who could barely walk, and casually discarded our entire history because it was inconvenient for his marketing narrative. He believed he did not owe me anything. He was about to find out exactly how much debt he actually carried. I turned my attention back to the attorney. Tell me about the lease agreement between the two companies. David pulled a stapled packet from the bottom of the stack. A sharp smile touched the corners of his mouth. Evan has been sloppy, David said. The operating company is supposed to pay a monthly licensing and rental fee to your holding company. Since your stroke 6 weeks ago, he missed the payment. He probably assumed you would not notice, or that it did not matter since the money stays in the family. It matters today, I said. Yes, it does. Under Section 4 of the agreement, you have the right to issue a notice of default. Once he receives the notice, he has exactly 30 calendar days to cure the default by paying the balance in full. Or you have the legal authority to terminate the lease and reassign every piece of equipment. 30 days. Just enough time for Evan to hang himself with his own arrogance. He was currently courting investors, trying to sell a portion of the operating company based on the illusion that he owned the entire infrastructure. If he lost the equipment right before his biggest conference of the year, his hollow shell of a company would collapse instantly. Draft the notice, I told him. David reached into his briefcase and produced a single sheet of heavy bond paper. He had already drafted it. He placed it carefully on the table, right next to my favorite heavy barrel pen. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. This was not a practice pad. This was a legal execution order for my son's inflated ego. I picked up the pen with my right hand. My fingers immediately began to tremble, protesting the unnatural grip. The muscles in my forearm seized, sending a sharp ache all the way up to my shoulder, but I refused to let go. I moved my left hand over, resting it heavily over my right knuckles to steady the shaking. Slowly, agonizingly, I dragged the ink across the page. The room was completely silent, except for the scratching of the nib against the thick paper. I focused all my remaining strength into the letters. It took nearly a full minute to complete the task. When I finally lifted the pen, I was breathing heavily, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. The signature was jagged and uneven, completely different from the smooth cursive I used before the stroke, but it was bold. It was pressed so deeply into the paper that it nearly tore through to the wood table underneath. David picked up the document, his eyes scanning the harsh lines of my name. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, before slipping the notice into a rigid cardboard envelope. I will send this via certified mail this afternoon, the attorney said, securing the flap. He will have to sign for it. The 30-day countdown starts the moment the mail carrier hands it to him. He will ignore it, I said, knowing my son better than anyone. He will look at the letter, assume I am just an angry old man throwing a tantrum, and throw it in a drawer. David placed his hand flat on the sealed envelope. If he does that, Sam, he loses everything. I looked at the empty space on the mantel where my framed photograph used to sit. He already lost everything, I replied. He just doesn't know it yet. The blue latex resistance band cut deeply into the palm of my right hand. My physical therapist, a young woman named Sarah, tapped her plastic clipboard against the metal railing of the parallel bars. "Hold the tension for 10 more seconds, Sam," she instructed, her voice echoing slightly in the large rehabilitation gym. The smell of wintergreen muscle rub and industrial floor cleaner burned my nose. My right arm shook violently, the muscles burning with a deep and electric ache, but I refused to let the band snap back. Sweat stung the corners of my eyes. I focused entirely on the heavy wall clock above the water fountain, watching the red second hand sweep past the 12. My phone vibrated inside my canvas gym bag on the floor. I let go of the band, grabbed a small towel to wipe my face, and reached for the phone with my good left hand. David's name flashed across the screen. "The Eagle landed at 10:15 this morning," the attorney said, skipping any polite greeting. The delivery was signed for by the front desk, and then the envelope was handed directly to the chief executive officer. "We have the certified mail receipt stamped and officially filed." "Did he call your office?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Not a word." That evening, the doorbell rang just after 7 o'clock. I rolled my wheelchair down the quiet hallway and pulled open the heavy oak front door. Thomas stood on the porch, looking completely exhausted. The operations manager had worked for me for 15 years, starting as a forklift driver and working his way up to managing the entire warehouse floor. Tonight, he smelled of stale coffee and diesel exhaust, and his company polo shirt was wrinkled and stained with grease. "Come in, Tom," I told him, backing the chair up to clear the doorway. He stepped inside, took off his canvas baseball cap, and ran a thick hand through his thinning hair. "I shouldn't be here, Sam, but somebody has to tell you what is going on over there." We moved into the kitchen. I poured him a glass of ice water, pushing it across the granite island. "A certified letter arrived from David's law firm today," Thomas said, taking a long drink. The receptionist handed it to Evan while we were in the middle of a major logistics meeting for the spring conference. I kept my face perfectly still. And what did my son do? He looked at the return address, rolled his eyes, and tossed it into the bottom drawer of his desk without even breaking the seal. Thomas gripped the glass tightly, his knuckles turning white. I told him he should probably open it. Certified mail from the company attorney usually means something is on fire. You know what he told me? I could guess, but I let the manager speak. He said, and I quote, "The old man is just throwing a tantrum because he misses his corner office." Then he told me to cancel the equipment maintenance budget for the rest of the month because he needed the capital to put a down payment on a new, imported sports car. A quiet and cold certainty settled over my chest. I had given Evan 30 calendar days to cure the lease default. He held the key to his own salvation in that bottom desk drawer, yet his pride absolutely refused to let him turn the lock. "The maintenance budget is not his to cancel," I said softly. "That is exactly what I tried to explain," Thomas fired back, throwing his hands in the air in frustration. "I told him the trucks belong to the holding company. We are just renting them." He laughed in my face. "Sam, he honestly believes that because he sits in the big chair, he owns the whole building." Thomas stayed for another hour, venting his frustrations about unpaid vendor invoices and Evan's complete obsession with his public image. When the manager finally left, I wheeled myself back into the study. I pulled out my leather folio and the heavy barrel pen. The paper waited for me. He had 30 days. 30 days to open an envelope and save his empire. I knew, with a dark and absolute certainty, that he would never touch it. The next 3 weeks passed in a quiet, disciplined rhythm. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I went to the rehabilitation clinic. My right leg grew slightly stronger, allowing me to trade the wheelchair for a heavy aluminum cane when moving around the house. My signature, practiced every single night under the warm glow of the desk lamp, transformed from a jagged scratch into a sharp and commanding mark. While I worked through the pain, Evan spent his time giving interviews to local business magazines. I saw the articles online. He posed in front of my massive lighting rigs, wearing custom-tailored suits, talking about his grand vision for the future of event management. Not once did his phone number appear on my screen. Not once did he visit to check on my recovery. He was building a castle on a foundation of sand, completely ignoring the massive storm gathering just off the coast. On the morning of the 30th day, David drove out to the house again. The attorney walked into my study holding a thin manila folder. He placed it carefully on the mahogany desk, right next to my practice pad. The top document was a copy of the Notice of Lease Default, stapled to a green, certified mail receipt bearing my son's careless and sprawling signature. "The contractual cure period expires at midnight tonight," David announced, checking his silver wristwatch. "I have received no phone calls, no emails, no wire transfers to cover the missing lease payments." I looked at the green slip of paper, It represented everything Evan had taken for granted. "Are the transport teams ready for tomorrow?" I asked. "The logistics company is on standby," David confirmed, his voice dropping into a solemn register. "We have the new storage facility secured, and the transfer orders are fully prepared. Once the clock strikes 12, Whitaker Event Management loses legal access to every single piece of operating equipment." My attorney looked at the framed photograph of the original warehouse that hung on the wall, then turned his gaze back to me. A heavy silence filled the room, carrying the weight of 40 years of hard labor and a lifetime of fatherhood. "He had a whole month to fix this, Sam." I picked up my pen, feeling the familiar and solid weight of the brass barrel resting perfectly against my fingers. "He didn't just ignore a letter, David," I replied quietly. "He just chose his future." The heavy leather binder landed on my mahogany desk with a dull thud. Thomas had smuggled the master inventory logs out of the warehouse, hiding them under his canvas work jacket. He stood near the doorway of my study, shifting his weight from one worn work boot to the other, while I flipped open the cover. The scent of machine oil and carbon paper drifted up from the pages. I ran my left index finger down the columns of printed text. 50 mobile staging platforms, 14 industrial diesel generators, 12 heavy transport trucks, and enough steel scaffolding to build a small city. Every single item carried a serial number registered exclusively to my holding company. "My son still has not opened the bottom drawer," the operations manager said quietly. "I checked this morning before he came into the office. The certified letter is just sitting there under a stack of old takeout menus." I kept my eyes on the inventory sheets. "We are on day 20 of the cure period, Thomas. Evan has 10 days left to pay the past due lease, or he loses legal access to every piece of hardware on these lists." Thomas walked over and sank into the armchair opposite my desk. The man looked exhausted, carrying deep, dark circles under his eyes. Evan had spent the last 3 weeks treating the staff like disposable tools, yelling at the dispatchers, and completely ignoring the angry phone calls from unpaid vendors. The operating company was suffocating under his mismanagement, and the warehouse crew felt the crushing weight of it every single day. "The boys are getting terrified," Thomas admitted, rubbing his calloused hands together. "Rumors are flying around the break room. People think the company is going bankrupt, and our fearless leader refuses to hold a staff meeting. He is too busy touring country clubs with potential investors." I closed the binder and looked directly at the man who had helped me load trucks 30 years ago. It was time to give him a choice. "When the contract expires at midnight on the 30th day, I am terminating the lease," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "David has already secured a new commercial storage facility on the north side of town. The logistics company will have flatbeds waiting. If Evan does not cure the default, every asset moves out of his warehouse before sunrise." Thomas stopped rubbing his hands. He stared at me, processing the massive scale of the operation. If the equipment vanished, Evan would have absolutely nothing left to run his upcoming conferences. The self-proclaimed business genius would be left holding an empty paper bag. "You are going to need drivers to move all that steel," Thomas finally said. "I will hire contractors for the night," I replied. "I do not want any of my people caught in the crossfire when Evan realizes what has happened. You all have families to feed, and you need your paychecks from the operating company." A slow and deliberate smile spread across the operations manager's weathered face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sam, you hired me when my oldest daughter was still in diapers. You paid for her college textbooks when my wife got sick." Thomas tapped a thick finger against the leather binder. "Evan signs the paychecks, but you built the house. The boys in the warehouse already know something is wrong, and they do not trust the man in the big office. If you are moving the gear, we are driving the trucks." A tight knot of tension unspooled in my chest. I had expected to fight this battle alone with my attorney, but loyalty turned out to be a currency my son could never understand. The employees had made their choice. They were going to help me reclaim the foundation. The final 10 days of the waiting period felt like holding my breath underwater. I channeled all my quiet rage into my physical recovery. Every morning, I pushed myself harder at the rehabilitation clinic, forcing my right leg to bear more weight until I could walk across the room with only a slight lean on my aluminum cane. Every night, I sat in the heavy leather chair in my study. It had become my new command center, replacing the corner office Evan had stolen from me. Under the warm yellow light of the desk lamp, I gripped my brass pen and practiced my signature. The jagged and uncontrollable lines slowly transformed back into smooth and deliberate strokes. My right hand remembered its strength. The name, Samuel Whitaker, flowed across the page with undeniable authority, preparing for the final documents that would end the illusion. On the evening of the 30th day, the house was perfectly silent. Outside, a light autumn rain washed the suburban streets, pattering softly against my study window. David arrived at 9 o'clock. The attorney wore a dark trench coat over his suit, carrying his battered briefcase like a loaded weapon. He took his usual seat across from my desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the master transition checklist. "The new facility is unlocked and ready," David said, crossing a line off the page with his silver pen. "The security codes have been updated. Thomas sent me a text message 10 minutes ago. The warehouse crew is standing by at a diner 2 miles down the road, waiting for the signal." I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, counting down the final hours. It was 10:15. "Has there been any communication from his office?" I asked. David shook his head. "I checked the firm accounts right before I drove over here. No wire transfers, no emails, no frantic phone calls begging for an extension. The certified notice of default is still sitting in his drawer." We sat in the quiet study, watching the hands of the clock edge closer to 12. I thought about the boy who used to run through the aisles of my first warehouse, marveling at the towering stacks of staging equipment. Then I thought about the arrogant man on the television screen, claiming he had built everything from nothing, refusing to pick up the phone to check on his crippled father. He had been given every opportunity to do the right thing, and he had chosen his pride every single time. The clock ticked past 11:30. The rain outside picked up, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. My right hand rested firmly on the arm of my leather chair, completely steady. I was no longer a broken old man waiting for scraps of affection. At exactly midnight, the grandfather clock began to chime. The deep notes echoed through the dark house, finalizing the death of the contract. David carefully capped his silver pen and looked across the desk. "The cure period is over," the attorney said quietly. "Whitaker Event Management just lost its empire." I reached for my phone to call Thomas. It was time to take my property back. I drank my black coffee on the back porch, watching the morning fog burn off the overgrown grass. And for the first time in 6 weeks, the quiet actually felt peaceful. The grandfather clock in the hallway had struck midnight 8 hours ago. The deadline had passed, and the legal umbilical cord between my holding company and my son's operating shell was officially severed. My phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. David did not bother asking how I was feeling. "The buyer's legal counsel contacted my office this morning," the attorney announced, his voice crackling slightly over the speaker. "They requested a standard estoppel certificate to verify the equipment lease was in good standing." I set my ceramic mug down on the patio table. Over the past month, Evan had been quietly negotiating with a private equity firm out of Chicago. He wanted to sell 40% of the operating company in exchange for a massive cash injection, branding himself as a self-made industry titan to the investors. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them the truth," David replied, a razor-thin edge of satisfaction cutting through his professional tone. "I informed their senior partner that the lease was formally terminated for non-payment as of midnight last night. Furthermore, I provided them with a copy of the default notice and the signed certified mail receipt, proving Evan received the warning 30 days ago." The Chicago firm was not stupid. During their due diligence period, their accountants would have reviewed the financial statements and realized Whitaker Event Management was completely devoid of hard assets. Evan only owned the brand name, the client list, and the payroll obligations. The massive fleet of trucks, the mobile stages, and the heavy lighting rigs all belonged to me. "They withdrew their letter of intent 20 minutes ago," David continued. "The investors realized they were about to spend millions of dollars on an empty shell. The sale is completely dead, Sam." I leaned back in my chair and listened to a blue jay calling from the oak tree. The Chicago firm was not just bringing a vanity valuation to my son. They were bringing the lifeline he desperately needed to cover his reckless spending. Without that cash infusion, the walls of his fragile kingdom were about to cave in. Thomas stopped by my house that evening. The operations manager looked like he had aged 5 years in a single afternoon. He dropped his heavy canvas jacket onto the kitchen stool and accepted a glass of iced tea, his calloused hands trembling slightly against the cold glass. "It is a total bloodbath down at the office," Thomas said, taking a long drink. "The Chicago deal fell through just before lunch." Evan walked out of his suite pale as a ghost, screaming at his financial director about leaked documents and corporate sabotage. "He blamed the financial director?" I asked, completely unsurprised. "He blamed everyone except himself," Thomas muttered, shaking his head in disgust. He shattered a glass coffee cup against the boardroom wall. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. The catering suppliers caught wind that the buyout collapsed. and they immediately panicked. My son had spent the last 2 months diverting company funds to finance his public relations campaign and his extravagant lifestyle, leaving the actual vendors waiting for their money. The floral company, the high-end caterers, and the security contractors all started calling at 2 o'clock, Thomas explained, wiping a bead of condensation from the granite island. They are demanding full payment for the past due invoices. The caterer outright threatened to withhold all food deliveries for the statewide technology conference this weekend, unless a wire transfer clears by tomorrow morning. I looked down at my right hand, slowly opening and closing my fingers, testing the returning strength in my joints. Evan had built a house of cards, relying on my flawless reputation to keep his creditors at bay. Now, the market was demanding actual capital, and his pockets were completely empty. Did he authorize the wire transfers? I asked softly. Thomas let out a harsh, barking laugh. With what money? He spent the cash reserves on that 10-year gala and the deposit for his new sports car. He actually ordered the accounting department to send the vendors another generic email, promising they would be paid in 30 days. The sheer arrogance of the decision was staggering. Instead of trying to fix the crumbling foundation, my son was still trying to protect his image, completely unaware that his biggest problem was not the angry caterers. His biggest problem was the heavy machinery sitting quietly in his warehouse. The next morning, I stood between the steel parallel bars at the rehabilitation clinic. The room smelled strongly of rubber floor mats and rubbing alcohol. Sarah, my physical therapist, stood 2 feet away, with her clipboard pressed against her chest. "Take a breath, Sam," she instructed gently. "Find your center." I let go of the metal rails. My right leg shook, protesting the sudden unsupported weight, but my heavy orthopedic shoe stayed planted firmly on the floor. I stood entirely on my own for 10 seconds, then took one slow, agonizing step forward. My muscles burned with a fierce electric heat, but I did not fall. I was finding my balance exactly as the man who stole my legacy was losing his. Friday evening arrived with a heavy and suffocating humidity. The statewide technology conference, the largest and most lucrative event of our corporate season, was scheduled to open its doors on Monday morning. The venue director expected our transport trucks to arrive at the downtown convention center for staging and assembly at dawn on Saturday. I sat in my quiet study, watching the rain streak the glass window. The phone on my mahogany desk lit up. "The boys are gathered at the diner," Thomas reported over the line, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The contracted drivers are here, and the flatbeds are fueled. We have the new security codes for the North Side storage facility. Wait for the sun to come up," I told the operations manager, feeling the cool brass of my heavy pen resting on the desk blotter. "Do everything strictly by the book. Bring the local sheriff's deputy to observe the property transfer, just as David arranged. Nobody takes a single piece of steel without checking the serial number against our holdings list." "Understood," Thomas replied. Conference week was about to begin. Evan honestly thought he could bluff his way through a massive financial crisis simply because he still held the physical keys to the equipment warehouse. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about the law. Keys are completely useless when you no longer own the doors. "Cut the padlocks," I told Thomas, gripping the cold plastic of my phone tightly against my ear. The heavy rumble of 14 diesel engines vibrated through the receiver, entirely drowning out the quiet hum of my kitchen refrigerator. My house smelled of dark roast coffee and the sharp metallic tang of impending rain, but my mind was entirely focused on the loading dock 10 miles away. "The sheriff is standing right next to me," the operations manager replied, raising his voice over the engine noise. He checked the transfer orders and the holding company documents. "The deputy gave us the green light, Sam. We are backing the flatbeds in right now." I opened my laptop on the granite counter. A digital map populated with glowing blue dots covered the screen, representing the tracking devices wired into every mobile stage and generator I owned. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. My son was likely asleep in his expensive custom bed, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was currently being unbolted and rolled onto the back of rented 18-wheelers. The physical transition took exactly 3 hours. Thomas kept the phone line open the entire time, providing a steady stream of updates. The warehouse crew moved with quiet precision, packing up the massive lighting rigs and the heavy steel scaffolding they had managed for years. These men had spent their entire careers learning how to handle my inventory, and they executed the extraction flawlessly. By the time the sun breached the horizon, every single blue dot on my screen had traveled across the city line, settling securely into the new storage facility David had leased under my name. I did not want to destroy the statewide technology conference, The innocent clients and the event attendees had absolutely nothing to do with my family disaster, so I needed to protect them. At 8 o'clock sharp, I dialed the venue director at the downtown convention center. Sam Whitaker, the director answered, sounding genuinely surprised. I thought you were still out on medical leave. I am calling to update our logistics plan for tomorrow morning, I said, leaning heavily against the counter to ease the dull ache in my right leg. Whitaker Event Management is no longer providing the hardware for your event. However, my holding company has authorized a direct lease to the convention center for the exact same price. The trucks will arrive at dawn, just as promised, but the invoices will come directly from me. A brief and heavy pause followed. The director was a seasoned veteran of the hospitality industry, and he clearly understood the sudden shift in power. Does Evan know about this arrangement? The man asked cautiously. My son no longer holds the keys to the equipment, I stated without raising my voice. You can accept my direct contract and keep your conference entirely on schedule, or you can try to run a technology summit without any stages or power generators. The choice is yours. He chose the safe route immediately, verbally agreeing to the new terms and promising to sign the paperwork David would email over within the hour. The conference would proceed exactly as planned, but my son would not earn a single penny from the operation. Monday morning arrived with a bright and unforgiving sun. I scheduled an extra session at the rehabilitation clinic, knowing exactly what was about to happen downtown. Sarah, my physical therapist, watched closely as I gripped the parallel bars, refusing to use my cane for the entire hour. Sweat soaked through my cotton shirt. My right calf muscle burned with a fiery intensity, vibrating from the sheer physical effort. But I forced myself to walk from one end of the room to the other. With every step, I imagined Evan walking into his empty warehouse. He would expect to find Thomas and the morning crew drinking coffee, preparing for the biggest day of their corporate calendar. Instead, he would find hollow echoes and bare concrete floors. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control, and that illusion was scheduled to shatter at exactly 9 o'clock. I finished my therapy session and sat down on a padded bench in the locker room. The air conditioning hummed loudly overhead, chilling the damp fabric against my spine. I reached into my canvas gym bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was entirely black, silently collecting data. I had turned off the ringer before I left the house, anticipating the incoming storm. Evan had likely driven straight to the convention center after finding the warehouse deserted. He would have marched through the double glass doors, wearing his tailored suit, ready to scream at the crew for leaving without his permission. Then, the venue director would have handed him the new lease agreement, showing the arrogant chief executive officer exactly who truly powered the event. I pressed the power button on the side of my device. The screen illuminated the dim locker room, revealing a long and cascading list of notifications. 35 missed calls. 12 of those calls were from my son, placed in rapid succession as sheer panic finally set in. 8 calls came from Thomas, confirming the hardware was successfully deployed on the venue floor under the new contract. 6 calls were from the venue director, verifying the transition was peaceful. 5 calls originated from the equipment dispatcher, seeking final routing approval for the empty trucks. The final 4 messages were from the commercial bank, demanding immediate answers regarding the sudden collapse of the operating company accounts. The digital numbers on the screen felt heavier than any weight I had lifted all morning. This was not a victory lap. This was the tragic sound of a hollow kingdom crashing down upon a foolish king. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to swipe the notifications away, when the device suddenly vibrated in my palm. The caller identification flashed a name I had not seen on my phone in over 2 months. It was Claire. My daughter-in-law was finally calling. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing steady against the loud hum of the locker room air conditioning. "Hello, Claire," I said quietly. A sharp and ragged exhale crackled through the speaker. "Sam? Are you okay?" "Evan told me you were completely incapacitated and unable to speak on the phone." I stood up from the padded bench, testing the weight on my right leg, and found my balance without needing the aluminum cane. I just finished a rigorous hour of physical therapy. My speech is perfectly fine, and my mind is entirely clear. "Why are you calling, Claire?" "The bank just called the house," my daughter-in-law whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. "They were looking for Evan, but he left his phone on the kitchen counter when he rushed out this morning. The commercial loan officer told me the operating accounts are severely overdrawn, and they need to verify the collateral on his new sports car." I closed my eyes, picturing the massive house my son had purchased just to impress his country club friends. He had built his entire marriage on the same fragile lies he used to run his business. The loan officer asked about the equipment warehouse, Claire continued, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a frantic rush. She asked if we still held the lease. I did not understand what she meant, Sam. I thought Evan owned the entire company. I thought he built it himself. The silence stretched between us, heavy and deeply uncomfortable, while I let the painful truth settle into her mind. He owns the brand name on the door, I explained gently, taking no pleasure in tearing down her reality. I own the warehouse, the transport trucks, and every single piece of staging hardware. I leased them to his operating company, but he stopped paying the bills 2 months ago. The contract was legally terminated at midnight on Friday. A soft gasp echoed over the line. Claire was a smart woman, and it only took her a few seconds to connect the missing pieces. She realized her husband had financed their lavish lifestyle by starving his own vendors and stealing credit from his crippled father. He mortgaged our entire future, she said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He lied to everyone. I told her to secure her personal bank accounts and ended the call, feeling a deep ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my stroke. Evan was not just destroying his career, he was burning down his own home. Later that afternoon, Thomas arrived at my house with a thick stack of folded papers tucked under his arm. The operations manager walked directly into the kitchen and dropped the documents onto the granite island. He smelled of rain and cheap diner coffee, but his eyes were bright with an intense and nervous energy. "It is an absolute bloodbath downtown," Thomas announced, pulling out a bar stool. The caterers and the floral suppliers showed up at the corporate office with private security guards at noon. They brought boxes of unpaid vendor invoices and demanded immediate payment. When the accounting department admitted the corporate accounts were completely frozen, the screaming started. I poured 2 glasses of ice water and slid one across the smooth stone counter. Where was Evan? He was hiding in his corner office, Thomas replied, taking a long drink. He tried to order the warehouse crew to drive over to the convention center and physically drag the equipment off the floor. He wanted to hold the technology conference hostage until the venue director paid him directly in cash. The sheer desperation of the plan was staggering. My son was backed into a corner, and his instinct was to commit corporate extortion. "What did the boys say to him?" I asked. A proud smile spread across the operations manager's weathered face. They handed him their corporate badges. Every single forklift driver, staging technician, and logistics coordinator walked out of the building. They left their keys on his mahogany desk and drove straight to the diner. The operating company has no assets, and now it has no staff. David walked through my front door 10 minutes later, carrying his battered leather briefcase. The attorney did not waste time with small talk. He moved straight to the dining room table, popped the brass latches, and pulled out a fresh stack of heavy parchment paper. "The transition is ready," David said, laying out the legal contracts. "We are establishing a new entity called Whitaker Employee Holdings. Thomas and the senior warehouse staff will collectively own 60% of the voting shares, and they will run the daily operations. You will retain 40% as a silent advisory partner." Thomas stared at the documents, his rough hands trembling slightly as he realized what I was offering. I was not just protecting their jobs. I was giving them the keys to the castle they had helped me build. "You boys earned this," I told him, pressing my favorite brass pen into his palm. "You protected the foundation when my son tried to sell it for scrap." Thomas signed the incorporation papers with a steady hand, securing a future for 30 families who had dedicated their lives to my business. The rain outside finally stopped, leaving a quiet stillness over the neighborhood. My phone buzzed against the table. It was Claire again, and this time, she was crying. "Sam," she sobbed, the sound breaking through the speaker. "He came home looking for the backup bank records." I asked him about the lease. I asked him why he took credit for your 40 years of hard work and why he bought a luxury car while his vendors were starving. "What did he say?" I asked, gripping the edge of the table. "He could not answer me," Claire whispered, her voice thick with heartbreak. "He just stared at me like a complete stranger. Then he grabbed his keys and slammed the front door." A cold spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. "Where is he going, Claire?" "He is driving out to the rehabilitation center," she warned, fear bleeding through every word. "He thinks you are still there for your afternoon session. He is furious, Sam. He blames you for ruining his life." I looked at the grandfather clock, standing quietly in the corner of the room. The time for running was over. I picked up my aluminum cane, feeling the solid and comforting weight of the metal in my hand, and walked toward the front door to finally meet my son. I called my medical transport driver and offered him double his usual rate for an immediate pickup, stepping out onto the porch before his white van even pulled into the neighborhood. The heavy rain from the afternoon had finally cleared, leaving the suburban air thick and smelling sharply of wet asphalt. 20 minutes later, the driver dropped me off at the outpatient rehabilitation clinic. I bypassed the main glass doors and made my way around the side of the brick building, leaning steadily on my aluminum cane, until I reached the courtyard garden. The outdoor space was specifically designed for quiet healing. A small limestone fountain trickled softly in the center, surrounded by raised planter boxes filled with damp cedar mulch and blooming hydrangeas. I sat down on a wrought iron bench near the water, resting both hands over the curved handle of my cane, and waited for the storm to make landfall. It did not take long. Less than 10 minutes passed before the heavy wooden gate at the edge of the courtyard slammed open, striking the brick wall with a violent crack. Evan marched up the gravel path, looking absolutely nothing like the polished executive who had given that television interview 6 weeks ago. His expensive silk tie was missing entirely, and his suit jacket hung open in a rumpled mess. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, making him look pale and completely unhinged. He spotted me on the bench and closed the distance between us, his leather shoes grinding aggressively into the wet stones. The 40-year-old man stopped 3 feet away, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "Are you out of your mind?" Evan shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I went to the front desk, and they said you had already checked out. I have been driving around the city for an hour looking for you." I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting the cool metal of my cane ground me. "I came back to meet you on neutral ground, Evan. Claire told me you were on your way here." "Do not bring my wife into this," he snapped, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You called the Chicago investors. You stole the equipment out of my warehouse in the middle of the night. You sent Thomas and the rest of the crew to the convention center and completely bypassed my authority. You deliberately destroyed my business." "Your business," I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the heavy and humid air. "Yes, my business." Evan paced back and forth across the narrow walkway, running both hands through his carefully styled hair until it stood up in frantic spikes. "I kept this entire operation running while you were lying in a hospital bed. I courted the clients, closed the deals, and secured the statewide conference. I built the modern version of Whitaker Event Management, and you just ripped it out from under me because you are jealous." I watched my son throw a temper tantrum in the middle of a quiet garden, and a profound wave of exhaustion washed over me. I had spent my entire life trying to teach him the value of hard work, yet he had learned absolutely nothing about accountability. "I did not take a single thing that belonged to you," I explained, keeping my tone measured and completely calm. "You own the operating shell. You own the client list. You were supposed to pay a monthly lease for the hardware, and you failed to do so. David sent you a legal notice of default by certified mail, giving you 30 full days to fix the problem." Evan stopped pacing and stared at me, his jaw working furiously as he tried to process the reality of his situation. "That letter was a bluff. You are my father. You do not evict your own son over a missed administrative payment. It stopped being an administrative issue the day you stood in my living room and told me you did not owe me anything," I replied, refusing to look away from his wide eyes. "You took my founder chair out of the office. You removed my photograph from the mantle. You used the company funds to buy a luxury sports car while ignoring the vendors who actually put food on the tables at your events. You believed the rules simply did not apply to you. Because I was the chief executive," he screamed, his face turning a dark and dangerous shade of red. "I deserved the respect. You owe me the respect for keeping your outdated company relevant." "Respect is earned through integrity, not demanded through a job title," I told him, gripping my cane tighter. "When the Chicago firm realized you owned absolutely no assets, they walked away. When your staff realized you were starving the vendors to fund your own ego, they handed in their badges. I did not force the caterers to march on your corporate office today, Evan. You invited them in by refusing to pay your bills." The absolute truth of his failure finally seemed to penetrate his thick armor of entitlement. The aggressive anger drained out of his face, leaving behind a hollow and terrifying emptiness. His broad shoulders slumped forward, completely defeated by the consequences of his own arrogance. "You ruined my company," he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked down at the wet gravel. I stood up from the iron bench, my right leg held firm, supporting my entire weight without a single second of hesitation. I looked directly into my son's eyes, feeling the final tether of my blind parental obligation snap cleanly in two. "No," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the absolute weight of 40 years of truth. I stopped pretending it was yours. Evan flinched, as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He turned slowly, his expensive shoes dragging against the stones, and walked back toward the wooden gate. I watched him leave the courtyard, a broken executive returning to an empty kingdom. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling my attention away from the empty path. I pulled the device out and saw David's name illuminating the screen. The attorney was waiting back at my house, sitting at the dining room table with the final employee ownership documents stacked neatly in front of him. The destruction of my son's illusion was finally over, and a single signature was all that remained to build something real. I rode the medical transport van back to my suburban neighborhood, watching the wet streets roll past the tinted windows. The afternoon storm had completely passed, leaving the air smelling sharply of damp pine needles and fresh asphalt. When the driver pulled into my driveway, I noticed two vehicles parked near the garage. David parked his silver sedan next to a heavy-duty transport truck from the equipment warehouse. I thanked the driver, stepped out onto the pavement, and walked up the concrete path using my aluminum cane. My right leg held steady, finding a solid rhythm against the ground. Thomas waited on the front porch, standing next to a massive piece of furniture covered by a quilted moving blanket. "We took a slight detour before coming over here," the operations manager said, reaching out to pull the heavy fabric away. There sat my original dark leather office chair. The deep creases in the seat perfectly matched the 40 years of hard labor I had poured into the company. Evan had banished it to a storage closet 5 years ago, replacing it with a minimalist mesh contraption that looked like modern art. Thomas and the warehouse boys had liberated my chair from the empty corporate suite. "The new employee holding company needs a boardroom," Thomas explained, a wide grin breaking across his weathered face. "And the boardroom needs the right chair for the senior advisor." I gripped the polished wooden armrest, tracing a familiar scratch near the edge. The leather felt cool and worn beneath my fingertips. "Bring it into the study, Thomas." David waited inside, sitting patiently at my mahogany dining table. The attorney had spread a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood, weighing them down with a heavy brass paperweight. The house smelled of fresh printer ink and the dark roast coffee brewing in the kitchen. Thomas wrestled the heavy leather chair into the study, placing it perfectly behind my desk, and then returned to the dining room. I took my seat at the head of the table. For the first time in 2 months, I did not feel like a fragile patient recovering from a stroke. I felt like the founder of a corporate empire. David slid the thickest binder toward the center of the table. "I drafted the purchase agreement exactly to your specifications, Sam." The lawyer looked up at Thomas, who stood near the doorway with his rough hands tucked into the pockets of his canvas jacket. "Whitaker Equipment Holdings is officially dissolving," David explained to the manager, his voice taking on a formal cadence. "In its place, we are establishing a new corporate entity. You and the 25 senior warehouse employees are purchasing 60% of the physical assets through a structured seller-financed loan. Sam is holding the note, and you will pay it back slowly using the profits from the new direct vendor contracts." Thomas stopped breathing. The big man stared at the binder, his eyes wide, completely unable to process the magnitude of the legal arrangement. I was not just giving them their jobs back. I was handing them the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom, completely bypassing the arrogant son who thought he was born to inherit it. "You are going to own the trucks," I told Thomas quietly. "You are going to own the mobile stages, the diesel generators, and the warehouse itself. You built this machinery right alongside me, and now your family is going to reap the actual rewards." Tears welled up in the operations manager's eyes. He blinked them away quickly, clearing his throat, and stepped up to the table. Thomas reached for the plastic pen David offered, gripping it with shaking fingers, and signed his name on the bottom line of the massive purchase agreement. Then, David turned the binder toward me. I looked down at the final signature line. 6 weeks ago, sitting in my wheelchair, I had struggled to hold a simple barrel pen. I had torn the paper, sweating in profound frustration, while my paralyzed muscles refused to obey my brain. Evan had looked at my physical weakness and decided I was completely useless, stripping away my dignity because he thought I could never fight back. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my heavy brass pen. The metal felt warm and perfectly balanced in my right hand. I did not need to use my left hand to steady my grip. I pressed the nib against the thick parchment paper. The dark ink flowed smoothly. My hand moved with absolute confidence, carving the letters of my name in deep and sweeping strokes. Samuel Whitaker. The signature was flawless. It did not look exactly like the cursive I used before my medical emergency, but it looked significantly stronger. It carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had lost everything and methodically taken it all back. David inspected the final page, closed the binder, and snapped the brass latches shut. The legal transition is complete. Whitaker Employee Holdings is officially in business. Thomas walked around the table and pulled me into a tight and bone-crushing hug. The smell of diesel fuel and hard work clung to his jacket, a scent I had missed more than anything over the last 2 months. "We will not let you down, Sam," the manager whispered fiercely. "We will protect this foundation." "I know you will," I replied, patting his broad shoulder. "Now go call the venue director at the convention center. You have a major technology conference to run tomorrow morning." The house grew perfectly quiet after David and Thomas finally left. I walked into my study, leaving my aluminum cane leaning against the door frame, and sat down in my original leather chair. The worn cushions welcomed me back like an old friend. The evening sun cast a warm orange glow through the window, illuminating the empty space on the mantel where my son's photograph used to sit. I did not feel angry looking at the bare wood. I just felt a profound and abiding peace. My phone buzzed against the desk blotter, vibrating against the polished mahogany. The screen lit up with a single notification. One new voicemail. I picked up the device and pressed the speaker button. A long and shuddering breath crackled through the audio receiver, followed by the heavy sound of rain hitting a car windshield. "Dad," Evan whispered. His voice sounded completely hollow, stripped of every ounce of arrogance and corporate pride. Claire packed her bags. The bank is foreclosing on the house on Monday, and the Chicago investors are threatening a massive fraud lawsuit. A long pause stretched through the recording, filled only by the rhythmic thumping of his windshield wipers. "I have nothing left," my son sobbed quietly. "Please, pick up the phone." I sat in the deepening twilight, listening to the recording play out to the very end, and let the screen fade to black. 6 months passed before I saw my son again. I drove my own truck, a heavy domestic pickup I bought after selling the suburban house, and parked across the street from a small community center on the south side of the city. The crisp spring air smelled of blooming dogwood trees and damp asphalt. I turned off the engine, resting both hands on the leather steering wheel, and looked through the windshield. Evan was working. He wore faded denim jeans and a plain gray cotton shirt, completely stripped of the custom silk ties and tailored suits he used to wear on television. The man who once called himself an industry titan was currently wrestling a stack of heavy folding chairs up the metal ramp of a rented box truck. He slipped, dropping one of the chairs onto the pavement with a loud metallic clatter. Evan cursed, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, but he did not scream. He did not look around for a warehouse technician to blame. He simply bent down, picked up the chair, and carried it into the dark cargo bay. The massive fraud lawsuit from the Chicago investors had completely wiped out his personal savings, forcing the commercial bank to foreclose on the giant country club mansion. Claire had finalized the divorce 3 months ago, taking her name off the ruined corporate shell. Evan had lost the business legacy, investor confidence, reputation, and succession rights, but he retained the chance to rebuild honestly. Now he was starting over. One rented truck, a modest local event, and his own 2 hands. I did not roll down the window to speak to him. I just put my truck into gear and drove away, leaving him to build something real. Later that afternoon, I walked through the double glass doors of the outpatient rehabilitation clinic for the very last time. The familiar scent of wintergreen muscle rub and bleach greeted me. I carried my aluminum cane in my left hand, completely relying on my right leg to support my weight as I crossed the rubber floor mats. Sarah stood near the parallel bars, holding a thick manila folder against her chest. "Your grip strength is in the 95th percentile for your age group, Sam," the physical therapist announced, handing me the discharge papers with a warm smile. "You do not need to come back here. Just keep up with the stretches at home." I took the folder with my right hand, feeling the smooth paper between my fingers. The muscles in my forearm did not shake, and my grip remained perfectly steady. I thanked Sarah, walked out into the bright afternoon sun, and tossed the aluminum cane into the back seat of my truck. I was finally done surviving. It was time to live. I drove straight to the North Side Industrial Park, pulling up to the massive corrugated steel gates of Whitaker Employee Holdings. The heavy roar of diesel engines and the sharp backing alarms of forklifts echoed across the loading dock. It was the absolute best sound in the world. Thomas spotted my truck and walked down the concrete ramp, holding a clipboard full of shipping manifests. The operations manager looked 10 years younger, grinning widely beneath his canvas baseball cap. "The staging rigs are loaded and ready for the music festival downtown. Thomas reported, shouting slightly over the noise of the yard. We just cleared the final vendor checks, and the accounts are fully funded. The boys are making a serious profit this quarter, Sam. You earned every penny of it, I told him, stepping out of the truck and walking up the ramp without any hesitation. How is the new dispatcher working out? He shows up on time and keeps the routing schedules tight, Thomas laughed, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. Come inside. The boardroom is ready for the advisory meeting. I followed him through the busy warehouse, breathing in the rich scent of machine oil and hot metal. The employees nodded and waved as I passed, their faces completely free of the tension and fear that had plagued them during my son's disastrous reign. They owned their labor now. I had successfully protected the innocent employees and left a lasting legacy. We entered a quiet office overlooking the main floor. My original dark leather chair sat proudly at the head of the long oak table, exactly where Thomas had placed it 6 months ago. I sank into the worn cushions, resting my hands on the familiar armrests, and looked out over the empire I had protected. I was no longer the boss, and I did not want to be. I was a silent partner, a trusted advisor, and a man who had retired with dignity. That evening, I sat on the wooden deck of my new cabin, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The sky turned a deep and bruised purple. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass pen, and turned it slowly between my fingers. When I suffered my stroke, I thought my life was over. When my son stood in my living room and told me he did not owe me anything, I thought my heart would physically break. I had spent 40 years giving him everything, assuming my love required me to build a kingdom for him to rule. I had been completely wrong. A father's job is not to hand over an empire to a boy who refuses to understand the dirt it was built on. Evan believed gratitude was a burden, and he thought ownership was an automatic right. He had to lose the entire illusion to finally learn the truth. He did not owe me anything. He was right about that. Love and respect cannot be collected like a debt, and they certainly cannot be forced. But I did not owe him my foundation, my dignity, or my legacy. I smiled in the quiet twilight, tucked the brass pen back into my pocket, and listened to the wind rustle through the trees. I had taken back my name, and in doing so, I had finally given my son the one thing he actually needed: a reason to grow up. When you build a life from the ground up, you naturally want to pass the master keys to your children. You spend decades pulling heavy loads, sacrificing your weekends, and losing sleep over payroll, all so your kids can start their race a few miles ahead of where you began. You want to give them the soft landing you never had. But sometimes, handing them the entire kingdom is the exact mechanism that destroys their ability to appreciate the dirt it was built upon. There is a massive and critical difference between supporting your family and subsidizing their absolute disrespect. As parents, we often confuse unconditional love with unconditional access to our assets. You might believe that your ultimate duty is to provide a seamless inheritance, but your actual duty is to raise a functioning adult. You pour your sweat into a business, a suburban home, or a retirement fund, expecting basic honor in return. When an adult child looks you in the eye and claims they do not owe you a single ounce of gratitude for the foundation you provided, you must believe them. Do not argue. Do not raise your voice or beg for the respect you rightfully earned. Just quietly close the door, call your attorney, and change the legal locks. Your legacy is not an automatic birthright. It is a profound privilege that must be maintained through basic human decency, humility, and ongoing respect. If your son or daughter truly believes they are a self-made titan, you must step back and let them actually make themselves. Taking back your legal power is not an act of petty vengeance. It is the ultimate act of parental clarity. You are not ruining their lives by removing your financial safety net. You are simply refusing to finance their destructive arrogance. Let them feel the actual weight of their own decisions. Let them face the angry creditors, the empty bank accounts, and the heavy consequences of a massive ego left unchecked. A fancy title on a glossy business card means absolutely nothing without the moral character and the work ethic required to actually lead. By stepping away and enforcing your legal boundaries, you protect the innocent people who helped you build your dream. You reward the loyal employees who actually respect the hustle, and most importantly, you give your entitled child the brutal but necessary gift of reality. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for a grown child is to let their fragile house of cards collapse. They have to lose the illusion to understand the value of honest labor. It is incredibly painful to watch someone you love fall from grace, but shielding them from the truth only creates a monster who will eventually destroy everything you built. Now, think about your own family dynamics and the boundaries you have set in your own life. Have you ever had to draw a hard and painful line with an ungrateful relative who confused your generosity with weakness? How did you find the strength to stop pretending everything was fine and finally take your power back? Share your experiences in the comments below, because your survival story might be exactly what another parent needs to hear today.